every so often, an invention comes along that so significantly changes the world, we can't imagine life without it. Imagine the moment someone realized you could warm up your coffee using radar, and that shortly thereafter, every house would have a microwave oven. Well, if that SUV looks as normal as a microwave, it's because these days, half of the cars produced globally are SUVs. And that is something that could have never happened without the Jeep Cherokee. This was the inflection point where the SUV went from a curious plaything for off-road nerds to a transportation device that was better for the masses than the existing sedans and wagons. It set the stage for the SUV to litter the automotive landscape with tall, poor-handling, ugly marshmallows on wheels. But the Cherokee was none of those things. The XJ might have been the progenitor of the SUV species, but it was also something else. This was America's favorite hot hatch. The fuel and economic crises of the 1970s forced automakers into considering a more fuel-efficient future. And so downsizing was at the top of everyone's priority list. Jeep's lineup had ballooned from the original 4x4 CJ to the Wagoneer, a wood-paneled 10-mile-per-gallon behemoth that absolutely needed to be replaced by something smaller and more efficient. When you downsize a car, you can't just grab the CAD file, select all, and scale everything to 80%. Not everything can shrink at exactly the same rate, lest you wind up with a car that doesn't fit important things like engines or people. But that's what Jeep's domestic competition tried to do by shrinking their truck-based land yachts. Chevy Blazer became S10 Blazer. Ford Bronco became the Bronco 2. And the resulting mini machines were seriously compromised. They had 2 doors only, could only fit 2 people in the back seat, and had relatively small cargo holds. Jeep took a very, very different approach to downsizing the Wagoneer. You might call it an experimental approach. Jeep did. The Cherokee's chassis code was XJ for experimental Jeep. And unlike its competitors, it wouldn't be a station wagon body on a pickup truck chassis. It would be its own bespoke thing through and through, and one with a very different goal: primary transportation. In other words, the XJ was designed to be a good car first and a 4-wheel drive second. And given the economic climate, its main focus would be on efficiency in packaging, weight, and powertrain. Perhaps Jeep's biggest efficiency gains came in packaging. The Cherokee wound up being 21 inches shorter than the Wagoneer and 6 inches narrower, and yet had only 10% less interior volume. And a lot of that space came from its unibody construction, something that just wasn't done at the time. In fact, other than the tiny little Lada Niva and a bunch of minuscule military runabouts, that was the world's first unit-body SUV. It weighed 1,000 pounds less than the Wagoneer, under 3,000, and yet it could tow 1.4 times its own weight. That initial 4,200-pound towing capacity grew further as the Cherokee aged and became more powerful. And it came courtesy of another great idea, which was to combine that unitized body with a boxed steel frame member welded around the perimeter. Called the Uni-Frame, the Cherokee had nearly 3 times the torsional stiffness of the body-on-frame Blazer, and it weighed 600 pounds less. That is how you do downsizing. Some additional space benefits came from, of all things, the suspension. The Cherokee kept Jeep's traditional solid axles, but this is the first Jeep to not use leaf springs. Now, the off-road crowd said this was a bad thing, but leaf springs necessarily require a long front overhang because they stick out so far. And a long front overhang hurts approach angle, and more importantly, is the enemy of interior space. But Jeep kept the leaf springs in the back because back here, tall coil springs would have been the enemy of cargo space. And so even though the Cherokee was 5 inches shorter than the Chevy Blazer, it had 1 1/3 times as much cargo capacity. And an even bigger differentiator is something we look at today and think, Well, that's completely obvious, but the Cherokee was the only compact SUV available with 4 doors. This is significant for a couple of reasons besides the obvious. The short overhangs allowed for a long wheelbase, which meant that the rear seats could be placed in front of the wheel well intrusions. All the other SUVs had the seats between them, which meant they were so narrow they could only fit 2 people across. The Cherokee fit 3, making this a real 5-passenger car with easy access to all seats. And what those passengers would experience would be the biggest differentiator between the Cherokee and all of its competition. A ride so smooth that Motor Trend called it astonishing. Who, as a nation, asked that same publication, leads the world in getting sumptuous ride quality from lightweight automobiles? Merci. Why, it is, of course, the French. Oh, c'est magnifique.
American Motors just made buying cars and trucks a lot easier.
Only the ones they can't sell.
Jeep might have been a brand of the American Motors Corporation.
But we want an import.
Then get the exciting Renault 18i or Le Car.
But controlling interest in AMC belonged to Renault, who had a lot to say about the XJ's suspension tuning. And mon Dieu, did it pay off. Jeep claims to have written the book on 4-wheel drive, said Motor Trend. But the French clearly did a good job of editing the manuscript where pavement running was concerned. And the Cherokee wasn't just plush, it handled well too, with Car and Driver pointing out, and I can't believe I'm saying these words, that it outgripped a Mercedes 190e on the skid pad. Jeep's focus on ride and handling was something that just hadn't been done before in the all-wheel drive space, prompting Automobile magazine to conclude that it was more of a 4-wheel drive car than an off-road truck. In a Motor Trend comparison test, the Cherokee wiped the floor with the S10 Blazer and Bronco 2 in every single category, winning the comparison test with such a lead that Motor Trend said it, quote, simply did too many things too well to be ranked as merely a match for the others, representing, quote, such an advancement over the other vehicles that there's little point in even talking about comparisons. The XJ completely won over the Enthusiast press, which is surprising given the Enthusiast sentiment at the time was to hate SUVs. Still is, if you ask me. Oh, no, not you. You're fine. This thing's fine. Car and Driver gushed. Automobile cavelled. And most surprising of all, Road and Track, the magazine only interested in sports and GT cars, fell head over heels in love with its long-term tester, with staffers fighting over the keys for everything from grocery runs to road trips to towing their race cars to the track. There are cars, and then there are cars, they explained. Some are simply transportation, not much more. Others are the objects of attachment, pride, and continuing pleasure. Their Cherokee was firmly in that latter camp. Just as important for a vehicle with a Jeep badge on it, though, was the reception by the off-roader crowd. And it was a hit. The Cherokee's solid axles gave constant ground clearance at the diffs, and the all-wheel drive options were no joke. Selectable 4-wheel drive called Command Track, and then Select Track, the American SUV industry's first ever full-time all-wheel drive. Off-road too, the Cherokee beat its competition easily, with off-road prowess sufficient to earn it something no other off-roader had done in history: a clean sweep, named 4x4 of the Year by all 3 leading off-road magazines. So it won over both the 4x4 crowd and traditional enthusiasts. The only thing left to conquer were customers. And that's where AMC often struggled, because its cars were designed by the visually impaired. One possible explanation for AMC's tortured styling was that its design department's natural light viewing area was a courtyard best described by Jeep designer Bob Nixon as, quote, a rat-infested slab of concrete in the trash area. Note the dumpster, and also that Range Rover hiding in the back. Well, maybe management would say yes to anything just to get out of that stinking dumpster courtyard. But while the rest of AMC's designs were visually challenged, the Cherokee was great looking. In retrospect, naming the Cherokee one of the 20 greatest cars of all time, Automobile Magazine's brilliant design columnist Robert Cumberford called it, quote, possibly the best SUV shape of all time. It is American ruggedness meets European simplicity of design. There's nothing gimmicky or cute here, just clean lines and purposeful shapes. It is, continued Cumberford, the paradigmatic model to which other SUV designers have since aspired. And if it looks entirely conventional today, it's because it is the basic two-box design that, together with the Mercedes G-Wagen and Range Rover, has often been imitated but never bettered. Jeep sold more than 3 million of the things over an almost impossible 17 years. The Cherokee did something so few cars have ever managed to do. It appealed to regular people and to the one-percenters, looking just as at home in front of a Beverly Hills mansion as it did in a suburban driveway or in the fields of a farmhouse. That classlessness is a defining characteristic of another genre of car, the hot hatch. And as time went by, the Cherokee became one of them, too. It started out with an all-new, but still pushrod, carbureted 2.5-liter four-cylinder. AMC's policy at the time was to not publish horsepower numbers, and that was probably a really good thing, because the 2.5-liter actually made about as much power as the old 4.2-liter straight-six that was in the Wagoneer, and was a lot more efficient. But as the Malaise-era gas woes waned, Jeep developed a new straight-six based on that four-cylinder, which found its way into the Cherokee for 1987. In its most potent form, it made 190 horsepower, the most of anything in SUV land, 40 horsepower more than even the V8-powered Range Rover. More on that Rover later, but even with the power-sapping optional 4-speed automatic, the Cherokee ripped to 60 miles an hour in 8.2 seconds and blasted through the quarter in 16.4 at 83. That is a third of a second quicker to 60 than not just the Volkswagen GTI, but the top-spec GTI 16-valve, which then could barely keep up with the Jeep through the quarter mile. And remember, all of the Jeep test cars were with the 4-speed automatic, not the much quicker 5-speed manual. And so you can add being a straight-line rocket to the Cherokee's already long list of accomplishments. And, by the way, if you don't think a comparison to a hot hatch is appropriate here, think again. At 165.3 inches long, the Cherokee is 3.5 inches shorter in length and 2.4 inches shorter in wheelbase than today's VW GTI. And it's the same width. This is a very small car. With very big appeal. The magazines called its cabin living room quiet with near-perfect ergonomics. They said Jeep combined excellent performance, excellent handling, rugged suspension, substantial comfort, and genius design to create a top-rated sport utility vehicle America and the world wouldn't soon forget. And most of all, it was, quote, a downright steal when compared to its newest rival, that new Range Rover. It was every bit as luxurious as its British counterpart, and will blow the doors off the Range Rover from a stoplight. Despite it costing only half as much, the Jeep did many things better, forcing even the Brits to admit that the Range Rover cannot automatically assume its familiar mantle of best off-road car. And you know the Brits hate to admit that anything American could be any good, much less a car that's like a quarter French, because everyone hates the French. The only thing the Range Rover did better was be bigger, and so when it came time to replace the Cherokee, Jeep's follow-up was even bigger and more luxurious. But since demand was so strong for the XJ, Jeep simply kept it alive and renamed its replacement the Grand Cherokee. Because grand means big in French. And so the Grand Cherokee and the Petite Cherokee were sold side by side for 8 more years, until the XJ was finally killed off in 2001 at the hands of a German. In charge, thanks to the Daimler-Chrysler merger, Wolfgang Bernhard called this an aging, somewhat bland SUV. And to prove how wrong that German was, Daimler-Chrysler replaced this icon with something it called the Liberty. The Liberty prioritized off-road capability rather than on-road usability, and then contradicted that toughness with styling that made it possibly the worst victim of the cute ute fad. Worse, it looked too cheap to be parked outside a decent apartment complex, much less a long Rodeo drive, and it gained 1,000 pounds over the Cherokee, and almost 2 seconds on the struggle to 60 miles an hour. The Liberty wasn't even close to a legitimate follow-up to the Cherokee. It was just simply transportation, not, as Road and Track had described this Jeep, an object of attachment, of pride, and of continuing pleasure. Same story with the Liberty's even worse 2014 replacement, embarrassingly named Cherokee. It was a front-wheel drive Dodge Dart-based insult to its own badge. Sorry, but it's true. This was a one-hit wonder, except that it changed the face of the entire automotive world. To quote Mr. Cumberford again, today's ubiquitous tall 4x4 station wagons all owe their existence to the Cherokee and its resounding commercial success. Hear, hear. I hope all of the 40 million SUVs produced each year understand where they came from. Good job, little buddy. Or should I say, merci pour tout mon petit Cherokee. Because it's French.